very special Irish Studies seminar, which was not on our original schedule and which is not on our accustomed day or even our accustomed time. But we have to go out of our way sometime to accommodate very distinguished visiting or demanding visiting scholars. And it's a really great pleasure to have back in Queen's someone who's an old friend of history and of Irish studies here, Sean Farrell. Many of you will know Sean. He is a professor of history at Northern Illinois University in the States, where he researches religion and popular politics in modern Ireland, has written widely on these themes, is the author of Rituals and Riots, Sectarian Violence and Political Culture in Ulster, 1784 to 1886. Has also written about the Irish in America, is co-author with Mathieu Billings of The Irish in Illinois, published in 2021. And his latest book, which we have the great pleasure of launching here in December 2023, Thomas Drew and the Making of Victorian Belfast, is a study of one of the most significant figures in the development of kind of orange popular culture and the relationship between evangelical Protestantism and working class society in 19th century Belfast. Sean is currently working on a synthetic essay on the challenge of sectarianism in 19th century Ireland, and also a research monograph, which areas will talk to us about today, on public health, the Blackstaff Nuisance, in particular a study of environmental disaster in Victorian Belfast. Sean is a frequent visitor here to us in Queen's. He's former president of the American Conference for Irish Studies, but he's here specifically with us, and I need to say this to keep the faculty happy, as the Queen's Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences faculty visiting global scholar for 2025. So Sean is going to talk to us on the topic, as you can see here, sanitary reform and the politics of public health in Victorian Belfast. So,
thanks, Peter. Thanks to everybody for coming in, both online and here in person. And I'd like to start to make those same people happy once again by thanking both the Institute of Irish Studies and the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics for the support with the Global Fellowship, particularly Peter and Olwen Purdue, who kindly sponsored my application. It's a very welcome marker, I think, of a long relationship with Queen's University Belfast. Something that both kind of warms my heart, but also freaks me out about how long it is. It's now coming up on 32 years ago when I first walked up to the Institute of Irish Studies on Fitzwilliam Street to do dissertation research when the Institute was under Ronnie Buchanan, the late Ronnie Buchanan's tutelage. But also when I was working for Jim Donnelly, my mentor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In short, I think coming here has been a big part of my life, and I'm very appreciative of the relationships, intellectual fellowship and support I've received from various people in this room and Queen's throughout the years. As Peter indicated, this talk today is based on some work I've been doing on different aspects of public health politics in early to mid-Victorian Belfast, on the Blackstaff Nuisance, and on Andrew Malcolm and the Belfast People's magazine in particular. I don't know if it'll be a monograph or a series of articles I want to put together, but there will be something that comes out of this on the politics of public health in the 1840s and 50s. And as this is a relatively early stage research project, I look forward to your feedback as I try to get a better sense of exactly what to do here. Now, between 1847 and 1852, health advocates published a series of highly visible sanitary advocacy essays and surveys of Belfast. Reports that combine detailed statistical profiles of working class districts with moralist lectures about the need for social and spiritual change. The proliferation of such studies in the late 1840s should come as no surprise. The surveys were responses to a series of interlocking crises that beset Belfast in these years: famine, epidemic disease, population growth, with each of the authors proposing measures designed to improve the health of the fast-growing town. In a broader sense, these projects reflect the remarkable success of the sanitary movement in Britain as well, marked by Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report of the condition of the laboring population of Great Britain and the passage of the Public Health Act in England of 1848. Now, my original thought was to focus on two of these Belfast projects, Andrew Malcolm's The Sanitary State of Belfast, 1852-3, itself initiated by a lesser-known survey of New Lodge Dispensary District, published in the Belfast People's Magazine in 1847, and the Reverend William O'Hanlon's Walks Amongst the Poor in Belfast, a compilation of 12 letters published in the Northern Whig in 1852. For the purpose of time, we'll focus on Malcolm's efforts today. Both Malcolm and O'Hanlon's texts are relatively well known to 19th century historians, who typically use them to portray the poverty and social dislocation in working class neighborhoods in and around the urban central core of famine-era Belfast, Smithfield, Millfield, etc. There's certainly good reason for this. Malcolm, and particularly O'Hanlon's texts, are rich and evocative portraits filled with heart-rending cases designed to mobilize public support for reform. While I certainly will not ignore these surveys' values as social historical texts, I'm more interested today in the texts themselves, in what Malcolm and his sanitary allies focused on in these works, and the degree to which the Belfast social reformers shared the views of their well-studied contemporary sanitarians. Public health is a notoriously slippery term with multiple meanings. Do we mean the state of public health? The institutions of public health? Or an ideal public health that we might aspire to or use to judge the past? My main focus in this project, in this talk today, is on its breadth of vision, on who is included and what is to be done under the rubric of public health. Now, in his landmark 1998 study, Public Health and Social Justice in the Age of Chadwick, Chris Hamlin argued that Victorian officials defined public health in narrow terms that brought significant technical and environmental improvements to urban communities, but were ultimately harmful to the health of British working class men, women, and children. To sum up a complex argument, Edwin Chadwick and his bureaucratic allies separated public health from questions of social justice, focusing almost exclusively on sanitary conditions rather than more holistic views that considered the social impact of low wages, food shortages, and unregulated working conditions. Chadwick's focus on systems of sewers and water, hosing down the poor, as Hamlin evocatively put it, offered a more politically palpable and possible, but ultimately limited vision of public health. While Malcolm was an admirable and humane man with apparently a good neck beard, I'm told, a close reading of these surveys makes clear that he and O'Hanlon worked at least closely with this Chadwickian paradigm. Not entirely, however, and the details are important, I think. Malcolm's vision of public health was certainly shaped by both Chadwick's technocratic vision and an allied approach favored by many doctors at the time known as state health. Moreover, he was increasingly concerned by the 1850s with working conditions in unregulated textile mills, while O'Hanlon, in his short works, implored mill owners to pay workers a fair wage, something that you won't find in Chadwick's writings, certainly. Both, sadly, for Belfast and for their families, died in 1856, quite young, both born in Newry, 1818 for the one, 1819 births for the other. So apparently I've got a little small circle that I'm working on here. But given their thoughts, the nature and contours of their thinking on public health seem particularly worth noting, given the halting and limited manner that public health provision developed, particularly for working class people in Victorian Belfast. Now, Andrew Malcolm was a pioneering figure in the history of Belfast public health. Born in Newry in 1818, the son of Eleanor Hunter of Dunmurry and Andrew Malcolm, a noted Presbyterian minister in both Newry and then Dunmurry. Malcolm moved to Belfast at a young age and was educated at the Belfast Academical Institution, where he did special work with Henry Montgomery, if we need to kind of continue that trend. I looked up all my Presbyterian stuff because I knew Andrew would be here. So I'm trying to cover my bases a little bit. So Malcolm moved to Belfast at a young age and was educated at the Belfast Academical Institution before doing medical training in both Dublin and Edinburgh, where he graduated with honors in 1842. He returned to Belfast that year, where he opened a practice in the family home in York Street and was elected a district medical attendant for the Belfast General Dispensary. 4 years later, he became an attending physician for the Belfast Fever Hospital in Frederick Street. Renamed the Belfast General Hospital after a new fever hospital was built with the workhouse in 1847. It was then renamed the Royal Belfast Hospital in 1875, and finally the Royal Victorian Hospital in 1899, shortly before it shifted to new premises on the Falls Road in 1903. This image, as you can helpfully tell, got from the Wellcome collections, identifies its time as the period of the Belfast Royal Hospital in the late 1870s and 80s. Malcolm constantly emphasized the value of data-based public health, arguments he made in a host of public and scholarly forums between 1847 and his untimely death in 1856. He was a determined advocate for making modern medical care more accessible, helping to open the first outpatient department at Belfast General Hospital in 1848, something that Belfast Hospital records say he ran actually on his own in 1850. This was not a man who was scared of work, that's for sure, as you'll see in a second. A leader of the Belfast Society for the Amelioration of the Working Classes, he was a champion of working class improvement, made clear in the pages of the Belfast People's Magazine, a monthly paper he edited in 1847 and early 1848. Malcolm was closely associated with the Belfast Public Baths and Wash House. In fact, he was so closely associated that he kept it open personally with his own money in the early 1850s when the finances were falling apart. This was an institution designed by Charles Lanyon. You see the image, the ubiquitous Charles Lanyon, architect, which opened on the Falls Road in May of 1847, an institution that was closed in the mid to late 50s and then sold in 1861 after a series of failed efforts to get the town council to purchase it. Malcolm, despite that failure, was a public-minded figure who worked actively with the town's civic leadership to try and improve public health. Most directly as one of the leaders of the Belfast Sanitary Committee, a story we will look at in some detail today. In his free time, he published the useful history of the Belfast General Hospital in 1851 and an important paper on the impact that working conditions in Belfast textile factories had on the respiratory systems of the women who worked there, one of 28 scholarly papers he published in 10 years of his career. The Royal Victoria Hospital later honored him by creating the Malcolm Exhibition and Prize for medical students in their final year of study. Malcolm initiated his project in the Belfast People's Magazine of April 1847, a paper that can be found in the Linen Hall here and down at National Library in hard copy. I haven't found any other issues, not widely available. I have it digitally now, so that if you ever need copies, send me a note. The series was intended, this was going to start this, let me start over. Malcolm initiated the project in the Belfast People's Magazine in April 47, making clear that his plan was to produce a sanitary survey of the whole town, publishing the results by dispensary districts, starting with New Lodge. The series was intended to cultivate popular support for sanitary reform amongst the people of Belfast. Malcolm argued that this was no longer a problem in England, where popular appreciation for the laws of sanitary reform was now the norm. But in Ireland, there was a real need for such work. He then moved on to describe the physical geography of the district, anchored by the New Lodge Road running from North Queen Street to the New Antrim Road. The neighborhood's natural setting, Malcolm argued, provided real advantages, particularly its elevated condition and the fact that it was sheltered from the north winds. Natural conditions, of course, were not determinative, and Malcolm's repeated visits to the district, he and a colleague inspected all 312 homes in New Lodge in late 1846 and early 1847, made clear that it was in desperate need of attention. Now, it's difficult to overstate the Sanitarian faith in statistics. Public health was yet another system of governance developed in the United Kingdom amidst the avalanche of printed numbers, as it's been said, from the 1830s. Malcolm clearly believed that statistical data had value for both public health and the practice of medicine. As he put it, statistical medicine appears to be calculated to unfold much as yet hidden regarding the etiology and treatment of disease. Both the New Lodge Survey and the Sanitary State epitomize these trends. Maps, numbers, statistics, and tables literally dominate Malcolm's work. Figures used to represent contemporary conditions and to underpin the need for sanitary reform measures, better sewerage, larger rooms and yards to improve ventilation, etc. Table 2 in his April 1847 article is a good example. Here he lists each street, row, or court in the New Lodge neighborhood, its dimensions, general state, and number of inhabitants. While most of the data was quantitative, there were qualitative assessments as well. Rather unhelpfully, Malcolm failed to provide a key as to what exactly differentiated indifferent or passable tenements. He then proceeded to discuss his findings, comments not included in the more widely publicized Sanitary State, saying that 2/3 of the neighborhood's houses were in an indifferent state of repair at best, a condition he blamed on the builder's priority to economize ground and material. Andrew Malcolm used the statistical data he collected as the standards by which he made his case for change. He often used numbers in a mechanical and methodical way characteristic of the Sanitarian project. For example, his April article argued that people needed the air provided by 336 cubic feet of space per person per day, a standard met by very few of the houses in New Lodge. Disease was particularly prevalent in the narrow confined backrooms of back-to-back tenements without yards, something made all the worse by unhealthy levels of refuse accumulation. Only the newer homes in Lepers Road and the newly finished Harding Street provided enough space and ventilation for the people who lived there. Some of his other statistical measures were a little less esoteric. 5% of the population, he argued, was constantly ill, so inquiries were required when numbers exceeded that measure. In his July installment, Malcolm listed the variables he used to assess the external state of localities, as he put it in such an aesthetic, pleasing way. Deficient surface cleansing, deficient drainage, deficient water supply, deficient ventilation, and deficient construction of housing. Malcolm argued that each of these conditions inevitably led to disease, epidemic fevers, cholera, diarrhea, dysentery. If an enemy truly wanted to conquer a city, he said, all it would have to do is stop up the city's sewers and wait for the ensuing deaths to mount. He followed this with historical examples to illustrate his point, using well-known stories like the St. Martin's Roundhouse murders of 1742 and the Black Hole of Calcutta, of course, to underline the dangers of insufficient ventilation. These historical lessons were then reinforced by 6 pages of examples from contemporary English sanitary reports, a powerful reminder of the way advocates wielded Chadwick's 1842 report. The third and what turned to be the final installment of this series appeared in November of 1847. It was only at this stage that Malcolm put the data gathered from his inspections in direct dialogue with hospital and dispensary returns. And it's essential, of course, to remember the larger context of the famine here, a point illustrated by Malcolm's statistics. The point illustrated by Malcolm's statistics. In 1847, for example, he lists 1,103 cases of fever in the hospital district, with 616 in 12 streets in New Lodge included in Malcolm's report. New Lodge Road, Pinkerton's Road, McNamara Court, and Hunter's Court. Malcolm opened the November issue with a visual diagram of his results, dramatized in terms of regions of disease and of comparative health. His statistical visuals would not have done very well, I think, with modern economists and various social sciences. High rates of illness prevailed, and either will my photographing skills, obviously, as well. High rates of illness prevailed amongst most New Lodge residents, something that Malcolm believed was a direct product of environmental factors. As he put it, since these were all the same class of residents, only sanitary conditions explain the differential rates of disease that prevailed in different parts of the district. Of course, we should be cautious in accepting Malcolm's assumptions about class and social life. As Joe Lee pointed out even longer than 32 years ago, external observers often fail to notice important social gradations that are obvious and important to working class and peasant populations. Now, the November piece is essentially Malcolm's discussion of the material presented here in a bad photograph of Table 3. The table presents data according to a variety of spatial, medical, and social variables, numbers of rooms and inhabitants, death and disease statistics, occupational and quality of housing. Malcolm's method was essentially one of drawing contrasts. In Lepers Row, for example, an average of 4 people lived in each three-room house, with rooms larger in size, with higher ceilings and flagged floors. As mentioned earlier, these houses had yards, and if the sewerage in Lepers Row was imperfect and incomplete by Malcolm's standards, there were at least sewers. It was these relatively tolerable sanitary conditions, Malcolm believed, that explained the comparative health of the inhabitants, with only 18 cases of illness and 5 deaths reported in Lepers Row, numbers that Malcolm believed were well within societal norms, a 3% illness rate. The picture changed dramatically when he looked at Hunter's Group, one of the lower tiered rows with back-to-back houses. Here, with an average of 9 people living in smaller 3-room houses with earthen floors, no backyards or sewers, disease and death were much more prevalent. Malcolm lists 77 severe illnesses and 22 deaths with a 13% sick rate. And these, again, the data and the kind of observations were made in the midst of a horrible fever epidemic that was taking place in early 1847. So your numbers would be disproportionately high here. While the doctor admitted that other variables were likely at play, the contrast in environmental conditions in the 2 neighborhoods underlined for him the fundamental necessity of sanitary reform. He proceeded to use the same method with Pinkerton Place, drawing a sharp contrast between the North Pinkerton Place, high illness and death rates tied to crowded conditions and poor ventilation, and the Better House South, which lay just outside of the region of disease. He concluded that sanitation in New Lodge was lamentably bad, with startlingly higher rates of illness and death than Belfast as a whole. It was, however, the differentiation in the health conditions on various streets that, for Malcolm at least, underlined the central role played by environmental factors. He then appealed to Belfast's civic pride for not the last time. Is such a state to be allowed? Such a sanitary state is a disgrace to us all. He closed the report with a corroborating letter from R.F. Dill, a member of the dispensary staff who had long worked in New Lodge. Now, Malcolm closed down the Belfast People's magazine in April of 1848 to better focus his attention on other medical and sanitary projects, namely the aforementioned Belfast Public Baths and Wash House and the Belfast Sanitary Committee, a body which he helped initiate with a public letter in the Northern Whig in late December of 1847. Now, there's little need for a detailed examination of Malcolm's letter, which reiterates the arguments and motifs of the New Lodge Survey, from its celebration of contemporary English sanitary thinking to the overwhelming use of statistical data. The data detailed in this letter involved the impact of the cholera epidemic of 1831 and 2, particularly in the Dock District, Cromac, Smithfield, and along the banks of the Blackstaff. stating that sanitary conditions now were, if anything, worse now than they had been before. To change this situation, what was needed was, and I quote, a continued, persevering, steady surveillance of the sanitary state of the town, as well as the systemization of sanitary regulations needed to protect Belfast's public health. Malcolm's immediate vehicle to achieve this was the Sanitary Committee, a local version of the sanitary associations that had been formed all across England. This, he argued, would help mobilize public opinion behind sanitary reform in Belfast, providing the backing that municipal government needed to implement real and lasting change, to use the powers it had obtained in recent town improvement acts. The committee would facilitate this by accumulating information, making that publicly available on a regular basis, and bringing its conclusions directly to the authorities. It is the operation of the Belfast Sanitary Committee from 1848 to 50 where we can see Andrew Malcolm's vision of sanitary reform implemented on the ground, a continued, persevering, and steady surveillance of the sanitary state of the town, enabled by a broad sense of crisis generated by the famine and by the cholera epidemic, of course, of 1848-9. A preliminary committee met a week after the publication of Malcolm's letter, chaired by the Reverend Thomas Drew, Church of Ireland minister of Christ Church, and led by Malcolm and Dr. Samuel Brown, a pioneering ophthalmologist, officer of health for the parish, and a critical ally in the fight for sanitary reform. It was this group that put together the reports drawn from Malcolm's data that led to the formation of the Belfast Sanitary Committee at a public meeting in early March of 1848, a gathering chaired by George Suffern, the Lord Mayor, and attended by leading figures in the clerical, medical, and political establishment. After Malcolm read the preliminary subcommittee's report, Thomas Drew and the Reverend William Johnston, minister of Townsend Presbyterian Church and somebody who'd be very active in the sanitary reform movement and working for the poor in general in the 50s, 60s, really. Both Drew and Johnston gave lengthy speeches in support of the new committee, detailing the negative impact of the regular flooding of the Blackstaff in Durham Street, as well as shortcomings in sewerage and water supply. Seemingly exhausted by Drew's typically hyperbolic and lengthy contribution to the meeting came to a close. The Belfast Sanitary Committee played an active and interventionist role in Belstaff life throughout the 2 years of its existence. Its various subcommittees met regularly, with the Inspections Committee meeting on a weekly basis and the General Committee meeting monthly. True to its mission, it worked diligently to educate the Belfast public about the necessity of sanitary reform. The committee issued more than 50 reports, with meetings covered prominently in Belfast newspapers. Deputation from the committee presented to the corporation on subjects like the Belfast Laundry and Wash House, sewerage, and the Blackstaff Nuisance, while other deputations met with largely working class audiences in the Brown Street School and a schoolroom connected to Herdman and Company's mill in Smithfield. If Thomas Drew's assertion that the exertions of the Sanitary Committee had taught the poor man to understand that he required a certain number of cubic feet of pure air around him seems optimistic or perhaps sarcastic, there can be little doubt that the committee's work was widely publicized and read. But the Sanitary Committee was not simply about getting information to the public. It also acted as a kind of hub for sanitary reform efforts in the town, coordinating with officers of the health, the police, and the town council on a variety of initiatives. The BSC was more than a coordinating body. It conducted its own inspections of problems brought to its attention by complaint and featured at least 40 health visitors, volunteers who moved through various districts, identifying problems that were then passed on to the committee or to the appropriate authorities for further action. The Northern Whig's meticulous report of an October 1849 meeting gives us a clear sense of the scale and scope of the committee's activities. After presenting the welcome news that cholera was on the decline, balanced by rising numbers of fever and dysentery at the time, Malcolm provided a list of significant nuisances that had been reported or observed, starting as per usual with the Blackstaff, made worse by open sewers running into it several places along its lower course. He then listed 25 stop sewers, 45 significant accumulations of manure, 5 extensive cesspools, including a flood of sewage at the back of 7 to 8 homes in Durham Street, 24 filthy areas, typically identified by street, and 36 house yards in need of cleaning. Malcolm reported that officers of health had served 10 notices, cleaned 11 houses, whitewashed 41 infected homes, and removed 81 vagrants from town. He closed the report by reminding committee members of the legal process that structured its work, which only underlined its coordinative role. After a complaint of a particular nuisance was heard, it was recorded on a ledger before an inspector was sent out to certify it as one. 2 officers of the health then signed a legal certificate to that effect, and this certificate was presented to a magistrate, who then issued a summons to offenders, potentially. According to Malcolm, most of these cases had led to orders for abatement, which offenders had to complete within a limited amount of time. These actions were done under the auspices of the recently passed Nuisance Removal Act, just as officers of the health for the parish completed their cleansing and whitewashing campaigns under the Town Improvement Acts. The Belfast Sanitary Committee's work was consistently applauded by the town's civic leadership, who celebrated the moral and physical benefits brought to the town's poor. It was clear, however, that they were more ambivalent about the need for a continued, persevering, and steady surveillance of the sanitary state of the town. There had been signs of the financial strain brought on by public fatigue throughout the committee's tenure. In his April 1849 report, for example, Malcolm announced that subscriptions had brought in less money in recent months and complained that the debts from the previous year had not yet been paid. Speaking in 1852, he lamented the fact that public interest in sanitary reform had lagged. It had not been enough to maintain the committee's work after the cholera epidemic in particular had subsided. Writing nearly 2 decades later, Samuel Brown agreed, arguing that as soon as the epidemic of 1849 had passed away, the general public seemed almost to have forgotten the lessons so dearly imparted, but I fear not learned. Whatever the reason, and cost was emphasized at the last final meeting, the Belfast Sanitary Committee ended its work in late March of 1850. This type of public health initiative, an active and interventionist effort to curb the worst environmental aspects of the pathogenic city, and thank you, Ian, for that, this was seen as a response to crisis, not as an everyday tool of governance. Malcolm certainly continued his frenetic pace of medical and sanitary advocacy in the 1850s, working at the hospital, the ophthalmic institution, and the Belfast Lying-in Hospital in Clifton Street, all the while writing his History of Belfast General Hospital, which he published in 1851. He was an active member of several scholarly societies, and in September of 1852, he presented a paper on the sanitary state of Belfast to the statistical section of the Belfast Association. Speaking after Dr. Henry McCormick, Malcolm provided a synthetic overview of Belfast's physical and urban environment, arguing that sanitary conditions across the town's various districts were inexorably linked to the prevalence of disease. Published later in 1852, 1853, in Sanitary State of Belfast, the pamphlet is replete with statistical data from Malcolm's exhaustive sanitary surveys. In many ways, the culmination of the work he began in New Lodge in 1847. It is built around 4 sections or propositions: a detailed description of the sanitary characteristics of the town; 2, the argument that the vital statistics of the town corroborate the sanitary laws already established; 3, that the incidence of epidemic disease is on the rise; and 4, he would provide some suggestions to improve the town's general health. In many ways, the tables, appendices, and maps are the heart of the work, since Malcolm's lecture lacked the emotive individual stories that made O'Hanlon's Walks Amongst the Poor in Belfast such a compelling and haunting read. This, of course, was as much a matter of genre and audience as training, since O'Hanlon's letters, and he was the Congregationalist minister in Donegal Road. Since O'Hanlon's letters were designed to persuade and mobilize the readers of the Northern Whig, surely a broader audience than the statistical section of the Belfast Association. Sanitary State replicates much of Malcolm's survey of New Lodge, even providing a reduced summary table of the 1847 project in its appendices. It opens with a thick description of some of the sanitary challenges created by Belfast's physical and urban environment, the low-lying ground of much of the town, the regular flooding that plagued so many districts, the overly crowded and often substandard quality of housing in some of its working-class neighborhoods. Of course, not all of his comments were negative. Malcolm underlined the higher quality, size, and ventilation of recent housing construction, and commended the town council for its work with the sanitary committee and the more stringent regulations it had drawn up in conjunction with his good friend and colleague, Dr. Samuel Brown. Malcolm hoped these regulations would prevent these types of problems in the future, an optimism that was characteristic, key to his success, and probably, as he will discover in a couple of years, a little naive. Working class housing certainly improved in the long run, but overcrowded and old substandard housing long remained a feature of Belfast life in Smithfield and other inner core neighborhoods. As Stephen Royal puts it, there was often a significant difference between the text of the regulation and the situation on the ground. In 1858, when health officers conducted a survey of the town, for example, they found hundreds of unpaved or badly paved streets and thousands of homes without a yard, drainage, or receptacle for human waste. Malcolm closed this section of Sanitary State by reiterating the importance of Belfast's environmental setting, which he argued was partially responsible for many of its primary sanitary defects. There was plenty of blame to go around, however, and he was clear that difficulties in the legislative process, the ruinous principle of laissez-faire, and the unchanged habits of its inhabitants, and not just its lower class ones, were also key factors in the deplorable sanitary state of Belfast. It's interesting, I was talking with Robin briefly about this before. It's interesting, this preparing for this talk really has given me a clearer sense of how far Malcolm is moving. You know, if you look at his publications in 1846, 47, and I think the winding up of the sanitary state, in particular, the way that the sanitary committee was wound down in March 1850, kind of moved him further along the need for more radical endeavor. And it's no accident, to my mind at least, that until his death in 1856, from 1852, he's kind of digging into factory conditions and pushing beyond that kind of initial Chadwickian framework to move into broader and more radical need for change. I've gotten a keener sense. Thank you for allowing me to have this talk, because it really has kind of forced me to come kind of dig down into this material closer. Now, the young doctor then proceeded, after drawing this environmental portrait, he then proceeded to use data from his 1847 survey to underline the relationship between the sanitary defects of an urban environment and endemic disease. Malcolm used his visitation statistics to detail the extent of fever in College, Cromac, Dock, Hospital, Shankill, and Smithfield districts. His discussion paralleled essentially his New Lodge survey, contrasting the prevalence of disease in streets with overcrowding, deficient drainage, ventilation, housing, and water supply, with a healthier state of the working class population living in newer streets and districts. Mapping the 1847 data onto his map of the 1831 and 2 cholera epidemic, Malcolm argued that it was significant that districts with the highest rates of disease were nearly identical in both cases. Many of the vital statistics were presented in tabular form, but in many ways, Malcolm's public health data is best represented in the maps in the appendices, which are, PowerPoint dream for lecturers, right? Looking at all the teaching that probably happens about the Blackstaff Nuisance. Perhaps we can overstate that. But this is my audience if I'm ever going to make that point. Right? Many of the vital statistics were presented in tabular form, but it was the maps, as we say, in the appendices, which detail the elevated parts of the town, areas which were regularly flooded, the impact of the Blackstaff Nuisance, the geography of overcrowding, new streets and improvements in the neighborhoods worst impacted by cholera in 1831-2 and fever in 1847. Well, that's the Blackstaff Nuisance one. As Malcolm concluded, the data all supported that great sanitary law, that disease, and especially fever or epidemic disease, is insolubly associated with defective drainage, defective ventilation, defective cleansing, defective supply of water, and to which may be added deficient or adulterated diet. And he started focusing more on diet and the food supply, moving in the 50s as well. After a relatively brief section that used vital statistics to make a compelling case that mortality rates and the incidence of epidemic disease had increased in Belfast between 1817 and 1850, a trend that would not continue over the long haul, must be said. 54, the cholera, 54 to 56, so you have cholera data from 1856. I believe that really there were high proportions of mortality, of morbidity in because of cholera in Belfast. Very high rates of death happen. But moving beyond that, that could not be, that portrait that he was not sustained as housing and treatment and a variety of variables moved forward in the late 1850s and 1860s, I think. 60s being particularly the case, I think. He certainly opened, again, that optimistic strand. He opened by celebrating the recent work of town authorities again, particularly the town council, which had used increased legislative powers to take a number of beneficial sanitary steps, removing nuisances, building drains, inspecting lodging and slaughterhouses, removing a few old houses, and widening old streets and building new ones. He was hesitant to go too far in his praise, however, making clear that some of these matters have been accomplished satisfactorily, and deprecating the fact that there was of yet no special health committee to organize such efforts. Predictably, he also praised voluntary efforts in the town, singling out the establishment of the public baths and washhouses and the work of the Belfast Sanitary Committee. There were, however, significant problems that demanded serious attention. Many of these were familiar and don't need to be rehearsed. The lack of effective drainage and sewers close to small and decaying tenements that were overcrowded with indigent tenants, the legal difficulties in getting nuisances removed, and the lack of sanitary education amongst all classes. Given the scale of problems involved, more legislative power and investment was required. Here, the Blackstaff Nuisance stood as the perfect example. Half measures simply would not do. Special legislation had been passed in 1850, the promised identified, and modest improvements made. But the sheer cost and scale of what was needed meant that little more was done to tackle the problem, and this certainly would continue for quite some time. The factors that led to sanitary problems were always present, he said, and as such, Malcolm argued that a permanent public health executive was needed rather than provisional or emergency associations, a clear reflection of his experience with the Belfast Sanitary Committee. Finally, he called for an extension of the boundaries of Belfast, something that did happen, was in the process of happening, and did happen in 1853, saying that wealthy landlords had in some case built housing in parts of the town that lay beyond sanitary regulation, a situation he contrasted with some proprietors who had built high-quality housing in suburbs where they looked after their tenantry with proper care. As ever, in most moments, Malcolm strove to balance his radical rationalism here with more cautious political instincts. Malcolm closed the survey with more general reflections on sanitary principles, the importance of pure air, water, individual cleanliness, and sanitary education, arguing that a true public health executive would advocate for the provision of parks and public squares, monitor the water supply closely, and make sure that sanitary education ranged from college to the humblest grammar school. He then sketched out a vision of a modern public health executive that was active, constant, and systematic. Given the scale of sanitary problems, a modern public health executive needed to expose and eradicate the sources of epidemic disease, regularly inspecting sewers and not just the surveyor's plans, and exercising a constant surveillance over water supply. The work, he insisted, must be excessive to be efficient, a slogan that surely Edwin Chadwick would have liked. That said, Malcolm's vision of public health is probably better identified with what is called state medicine in the literature than Chadwick's technocratic vision. Essentially, state medicine was an alternative expert-based approach to public health reform favored by the medical profession and the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science, two of the pillars of Andrew Malcolm's data-based approach to public life. Widely discussed in Scotland, where it will be remembered Malcolm trained, state medicine envisioned the collective and preventative use of medicine rather than the curative and individual approach, an approach that blended fairly easily with Chadwick's environmental focus on sanitation and system. As Malcolm put it, were the government of the day more in the habit of consulting with the medical profession of this country, many most lamentable expeditions would not have been attempted. Many thousands of Britain's best sons would not have fallen prematurely victims to the stupidity or ignorance of the executive, and the public health in all its manifold departments would receive that need of appreciation from the public at large, which it most undoubtedly deserves and must ultimately possess. State medicine and the public weal are inseparably associated, whether we admit it or not, and no government can be said to do its duty well, which does not practically recognize this great truth. Malcolm's essay closed on a less optimistic note than he had done throughout his career, perhaps a reflection of a more realistic assessment of civic life after his experience with the Belfast Sanitary Committee. Cholera was again on the march, he argued, and he feared that the northern capital and Britain as a whole was not prepared. The sanitary associations that had done so much good in England and Ireland had been disbanded. Sanitary laws, as all properly educated people knew, meant that disease prevailed when communities let their guard down. When cholera returned to Belfast in 1854-5, municipal authorities worked hard to mitigate the worst of its effects, but the northern capital was hard hit, certainly, one of the most severely impacted of large Irish towns, with the Poor Law Commissioners listing nearly 2,000 cases and 677 deaths. In this, at least, Malcolm had been right. The cost of half measures in public health was high indeed. Don't I know that, coming from where I do. Andrew Malcolm was a pioneering figure in the history of public health in Belfast, a man who, with Dr. Samuel Brown and others, helped to direct the northern capital's public health response to the interlocking crises of the late 1840s. His public career, histories, and surveys have provided rich and valuable material for historians exploring the political and social history of this era of crisis and transition in Belfast. But they do more than that. They underlie the vision of a radical if politically judicious public health advocate, a doctor committed to state medicine who was obsessed with sanitary reform. Malcolm's plea for a constant and steady surveillance of the sanitary state of Belfast proved to be too costly and radical for the town's leadership, for its politics, whose leaders saw it as an approach better suited to crisis management rather than everyday governance. Things did change on the ground, of course. New higher quality housing was built in the 1850s and particularly the 1860s and early 70s. Larger homes with more ventilation, access to sewerage was expanded, and the town council approved a number of urban improvement projects that transformed the rapidly growing town's civic landscape. As Stephen Royal has argued, however, these projects tended to be focus on expressions of civic pride rather than measures designed to improve the quality of life in working class districts. Many of the things that Malcolm had championed did come to Belfast in the 1870s, when park access was expanded, Ormeau Falls Parks, and water supply improved dramatically. Nor was Belfast alone in this type of display. This is not an exceptionalist portrait here. Birmingham, later famous as the home of gas and water socialism and all of that, was notoriously slow to implement improvement schemes in the late 1850s and 60s as well. And we could push up a bunch of English examples here, certainly. The cost of this delay, however, was high indeed, as Andrew Malcolm had known well enough. Thank you very much. Appreciate your
John, thank you very much. Don't take a seat here, and then we'll move to questions. So we have an audience in the room and also one online. So if you're online, would like to ask a question, just indicate, raise your hand digitally, and Becca will let us know. But let's start with the room. Would anyone like to ask an open question? Start, Lynn.
Sean, when I think of public health reform, I think particularly of infant and child mortality. Do you focus or indeed collect any statistics on either infant or
Malcolm did not, that I'm aware of. He did work and volunteer at Brown's Ophthalmology. We're getting into dangerous territory for me. Ophthalmology, his clinic and he was one of the first people who worked with children, and I worked with children, but I haven't come across any specific data on infant mortality. No, within Malcolm's work, certainly not in the Sanitary project. There's no special categories put up for infant and children. No, I don't. It's
it's a vital force in reducing child mortality historically.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that, in part, I think it reflects the kind of Chadwickian focus, if you will, of particularly his early, when he's cataloging the survey, it's really, he's not paying as much time to kind of a more holistic view of public health that might kind of focus on some of the infant mortality, on food. One might even mention, say, wages and public health, et cetera. But yeah, there's no particular focus on infant mortality that I know, which is, I think, again, it reveals that one of many kind of problems with the public health, the limited nature of the public health report approach in the 1840s and early 50s.
Yes.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm not quite sure if you mentioned this. So did he sort of link up that there was more fever-related deaths that were in closer proximity to the hospitals? I don't know if you did mention that there was that you drew a link towards.
No, I don't. Certainly, I'm trying to remember my maps and whatnot. He certainly did not link up the proximity of hospitals to surrounding rates of mortality. No, although it certainly makes sense. It's this mechanical. I mean, a lot of the sanitary state and a lot of these surveys that he's doing is fairly mechanical in its application of kind of statistic and then description of statistic. So it doesn't get into the qualitative analysis. At times is quite limited. Yeah.
But he does seem to sort of change his idea from being quite sort of an ardent miasmatist, moving in slightly into the theory that there is something more, contagion related.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, again, it is pivoting. The pivot there is 50, 51. He's shifting his ground into more contagion, but he is very cautious in that period when doctors are debating Snow's theories and whatnot, right? He's very hesitant to make that jump on board publicly. But I think you're right, though, as he shifts in the 50s, and perhaps as contagious-based arguments gather more support across the medical establishment, he's certainly shifting in that direction. The study of workout, the female textile workers in the mill, I think there's like 2,800 women that he studies in that particular case. That is clearly he's thinking along contagion lines. Absolutely.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Super.
Okay, Sean.
My pleasure.
I suppose, based on what you said to the others, maybe he doesn't, but is there any reflection on ethnicity or religion in any of this?
None at all.
That's quite striking considering, big ones in London at the time large together.
No, they're quite there's no references to denomination. and in kind of the march at the, various kind of the Belfast Sanitary Committee in particular is like honored and lauded for not taking politics and not taking religion, and that's their badge of, but I'm thinking across all the public speeches and the various publications, no, there's no kind of breaking down like Presbyterian, Anglican, Catholic, all of that.
Racial, as in like people who come from different societies.
There's a little bit of that sometimes, but not much of a focus on it, right? Which is is interesting. Again, it really is, pretty mechanical in its use of data and not much discussion of qualitative. And I think in many, he doesn't have much primary, like his papers are fairly limited. I'm trying to, Caldwell, who did a biography of Malcolm, it's very, it's not fleshed out fully, let's put it that way. It's very kind of episodic, I suppose. He got the family papers to write that. He has papers in Prony, Caldwell does, which are typescripts of the correspondence and his research notes and whatnot. But I'm trying to track down if there's more papers out there, either somewhere else or if the family's got them. I've kind of been trying to decide what exactly I'm going to do this before I make this commitment to going further with this. But I think, there's enough there to do some work. So I don't have much of a portrait of, in other words, of the kind of the thoughts of the man that lead to the public action. There is correspondence, and I was going through it right before the talk because I was done at the time. There's about 50, 60 letters from 1848 and 9 to 54 or so, and they're mostly they're professional networks. So a lot of it, and some of it goes back to your question about contagion, and he's so just not committing to any of the sides of the debates on what, but I couldn't come across much that would reveal some of the internal thinking for why he did what he did, other than what he says. So it's a little frustrating in that sense at this point. So he doesn't, I'm so used to somebody who's speaking exactly about Catholic and Protestant and Presbyterian in 1848 and 9 that it's quite striking, the difference.
Andrew. Just actually following up on that. And the other person you were going to talk about was O'Hanlon. And O'Hanlon's approach is so different.
Yeah.
Low stats, it's all moral persuasion and blackmail.
It really is.
Within the realms of this professedly Christian town, you have all this, and I just wonder, what do you think the connection is between Malcolm's quite sort of technocratic, statistic driven and that moral persuasion? Because it's Drew and William Johnson who are at the meeting, and they're providing the color and stuff. How does Malcolm relate to that type of rhetoric?
Yeah. One, presumably, if you're talking about Drew and Johnston doesn't, it's interesting, Johnston doesn't do too much of it in the same space. Yeah, but Drew does. He's very uncomfortable with that. And I think, O'Hanlon, just to loop back on O'Hanlon, and they're connected through the broader kind of Chadwickian commitment to the notion that sanitary reform will help transform civilization, will improve the lives. They believe that. O'Hanlon goes about it entirely different. As he said, I was going to joke, the walks amongst the poor to Belfast. There are 4 chapters of walks, and 8 chapters of moral lectures. So it's really kind of talks to the poor of Belfast. It would be a better title in a lot of ways. I've been trying to get that line off for a bit, so thank you for that. O'Hanlon's, it is a literary production, right? It is very much using these kind of really melodramatic stories of people suffering because of this behavior that is designed to get them to change and mobilize people behind them. The only connection really is that kind of broad link to Chadwick and to the project. O'Hanlon explicitly talks and says Malcolm's work is tremendously valuable. You should all read it. I think that's very early on in the walks. But yeah, they have very different methodologies. And as I need to dig more into O'Hanlon to get a better sense of the variation. They're just generally committed to the importance, the transformative nature of sanitary reform, but certainly, moral blackmail vis-a-vis, just kind of what Malcolm's selling was like, which is also, I mean, it is a surveillance. Foucault would have a lot of time, but it is a surveillance state, this voluntary committee that's visiting all these sites and digging up all these problems and getting people to to put grievances for so they can get changed and bringing people, offenders up, all of this.
But I suppose that's all part of associational culture.
Right, yeah.
And voluntarism. Because O'Hanlon was in Lancashire,
Mhm.
we came to Belfast and already written an essay on
Mhm.
the improvement of the operative classes.
Right, yeah.
So I suppose O'Hanlon is not in the same type of field with Malcolm in terms of a medical profession and stuff. But Malcolm, in order to make sure that what he wants to happen happens, needs to rely upon O'Hanlon and evangelicals and others who are all morally and spiritually out there.
Right. No, he has to bring this coalition, and some of his prime advocates are people like Drew. I mean, O'Hanlon's an easy conversation compared for somebody, and of course, and I need to dig into this much further. Malcolm's father, of course, was a minister as well, so not like he's unfamiliar, although very different church and congregation than we're talking about. But it is really the professional background, I think, is very critical in the varieties of sanitation reform that they end up advocating. Absolutely.
Okay. Yes, Robin.
Following up on that, a lot of the associational culture in Belfast obviously relies on women as visitors and fundraisers. Is that part of the work that's done through committee, or is it all male?
It's all male. So it is quite striking that it is not, because I'm very familiar with Drew and the Christ Church's women's, and all those networks and have you. The Sanitary Committee, and I haven't dug into, I don't have hard data on who the visitors were. I'm going to have to dig into what that is to see, to be able to say 100% sure. But there's no evidence at this point that there are any women involved, and that is very surprising, given associational cultures. It's also interesting because he gets married in 1854 to a woman who is an incredibly active, progressive philanthropist who runs or is very involved in Belfast domestic missions. Glennie is her last name. I'm Maria Glennie. They get married in 1854. Marriage doesn't. They have a son who dies, but then Malcolm dies in 1850. She lasts on. She's very active and with a domestic mission and whatnot. So your comment, it's even more irony if this is an all-male space that he ends up marrying a woman who's running one of these associational cultures, having some of the same commitments.
Okay. Any questions online?
No.
That's fair. So I've got a question, Sean. So from what I can remember, the 1848 Public Health Act in England attempts to implement that run into a lot of difficulties in clashes with parochial vested interests over graveyards, burial sites,
right,
in particular. Robin's doing important work on the crisis and burials brought on by the famine in Belfast. But from your reading, I mean, are public burials and burial sites, the overcrowding of existing burial sites, part of the public health crisis that?
Definitely. And Malcolm talks about it. I mean, in Sanitary State, it's not a huge section, but he has a section of Sanitary State that is devoted to that controversy, to burial processes and graveyards and various controversies about that. And of course, Drew is always quoted, right, for his comments about how any minister who goes to Shankill Graveyard and any minister who goes there, knows just in what a shocking state of affairs those are at that point. So I'm very familiar with the controversies. They're not front and center in Malcolm's vision, but again, I think maybe reflecting the controversies you're working on, Robin, they become part of the portrait by 1852. They're not there in 1847, but again, that New Lodge survey was more just a sketch. I don't see, I'm thinking through my People's Magazine, which I know pretty much word for word, tragically, not a good sign for my life in a lot of ways, as is 32 years of visits. But I can't think of anything in the People's Magazine that any features on that issue either. I'll look back and go through, and if I come across something, I'll certainly shoot you a line.
I've got one more comment, sorry.
Yeah.
So does he have any take on vaccination?
Vaccination, we don't, it doesn't come up in any of the works here. So I have not, to be fair, I have not read all 28 of the scientific papers. So maybe Ian can help me with that. But I don't, in any of the public work and I've read about, and on the ones that would be kind of related, I haven't seen any evidence of that. No. It's a good question, particularly given the world we live in.
Well, it's it's a while since I read the text. Excuse me, but from what I can remember, and I think this kind of fits with what you've been saying, there is a kind of, with regard to sanitation, housing, paving, etc. There's very much a kind of meliorist approach here. It's contrasting areas. You mentioned the two ends of the one street, one of which is improved, where sanitary outcomes on health outcomes are much better. So you can see, a kind of direction of travel. If we publicize and raise consciousness about this, this will put pressure on the council, developers, whatever, to move towards that already existing model of improvement. The one exception with all of that is the section on the health of the women linen workers, right, in the wet spinning process, because to raise that question at all is to really put yourself in direct confrontation with the linen masters of Belfast, who may be quite happy to kind of get on board with the meliorist message, at least theoretically, of housing improvement, but to challenge the economic interests of the dominant industry is really something quite different and dangerous potentially as well.
Well, it is even more different if you kind of think back to, like, if you look at who, the Mulholland, he and Mulholland worked together to form the Society of the Amelioration for the Working Classes in 45, 46. He has a lot of the mill owners on board with the Sanitary Committee. So the only thing I can kind of think is again, this kind of radicalization, this kind of he's moving in the 50s more towards this contagion, this kind of focus on workhouse. It's mentioned in Sanitary State, there is some mention of workhouse stuff, but it's really the later papers which really dig into, that come from his statistical portraits. He's clearly interested in that, and it's the detailed papers. They reveal that he's been doing those he applied to be inspector of factories. He applied for nearly every post in Belfast, actually. But looking to the correspondence at 3:40 today, there are several letters about he was trying to line up people's support so he could get this post as inspector, and he doesn't end up getting it. But he clearly, in the paper, if you look at the one with dealing with women and kind of the negative impact on respiratory systems that is from the spinning process, he's clearly spent a lot of time in factories in those spaces. This is something, but we don't see much in the early years of that. We certainly see it by the 50s too. And again, I'm coming more and more upon this kind of, and putting this together for you guys has really helped me see he has such a short career that there's a tendency to see him kind of as this kind of pioneering advocate for public health. He was ahead of his time. This kind of stuff. And that's all true. but it also understates the degree to which he moves from 46 to 52 and 3. That there's a moving target that, you know, and I personally am coming to see that kind of the fact that he couldn't get support in 50 to keep the Belfast Sanitary Committee project going. The lack of support that he got, I see that as a real, you know, something that moved him further along the line politically. That's a really important transition point. And I'll have to dig up more data, more kind of contemporary stuff, more correspondence, and to really be able to shell that out. But I'm pretty convinced by that, because he doesn't write that early stuff. None of the stuff you're talking about. He's really committed seemingly to that ameliorative model, and then shifts much more forcefully in the 52, 53, 54 years. You know?
He doesn't have any connection with John Ray at the challenges. No, in the mid-50s, by the mid-50s.
No, I have
well clear.
If I can bring John Ray into a paper, I always will. There's no opportunity here.
Okay, great. Any questions online? Anybody? No? Anybody? Last opportunity.
Put the internet to sleep.
Well, look, thanks very much, Sean.
My
It's
pleasure.
always great to have you here. This is really important and fascinating work. And Malcolm's life and career is something I think everyone should know with regard to the history of Belfast. I shall incorporate some of his maps into my teaching on the MA class of Belfast history in the autumn. But we have a late question online, do we?
Oh yes, it's just
Back up again.
So Marta says, thank you for a very interesting lecture. You referred to statistics stating the desirable number of cubic meters per person per room. Was there any contemplated solution for those who live in inadequate dwellings? Did Malcolm's writings lead to policy debates in that respect?
No, there's no. No, and I haven't. I must admit, I also haven't. Malcolm's project certainly did not lead to debates on that. Certainly the Chadwick and the kind of more well-known sanitarian things in England generated a number of debates on a variety of issues. I haven't dug into those extant conversations. I'm not prepared to give a more firm answer on the number of cubic feet that people are advocating of pure air. But thank you for the question. I really appreciate it.
Something that comes into the Passenger Act.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Immigration regulation at the same time for the prison debates as well. Something I don't know, Elaine. Spaces, maybe.
Some of the cells, yes, but
Yeah.
people have the same concern.
Yeah.
You have concerns about maybe diseases spreading.
Yes.
In the prison, it's not the same type of concerns.
Great. Okay. We'll have you back again, Sean, in a few years' time when the book or article, or whatever this turns into, is done. Until then, I should say, Sean is here for another couple of weeks until the 18th. Is that
That's
right? Of May. So if anyone wants to have coffee with him, have a chat, talk about his work, he's around and more than happy. So I sure put words into your mouth.
Absolutely. I'd love to see people. That's great.
Can we finish by thanking Sean? I think before people go, we've got one. Actually, have a few other Irish Studies events coming up, but we've the last regular seminar of the series coming up next Tuesday, not on Monday because it's a bank holiday, but on Tuesday at 4:30 in this room. Kieran O'Neill of Trinity College Dublin is coming to talk about his new or recent book, Power and Powerlessness in Union Ireland, Life in a Palliative State. It's a very challenging, very interesting, intellectually stimulating view of the nature of power and challenges to power and powerlessness in the Union period from 1800 to 1922. So do come along if you're free. Join us at 4:30 next Tuesday in this room. Thank you.